Hey Sam, this is Mr. Yoon, and I'm here to make this YouTube video to help you clarify negative fractions. Now, in this video, I'll try to go over some sample questions and also talk about the theory behind positive negative fractions. All right, so let's just start with a basic fraction like 3 over 4. Before I get into the math behind before I get into like adding and subtracting and multiplying and dividing fractions, I just want to show you the difference between these three different scenarios here. Okay, so I have 3 over 4 and I have 3 over 4 and 3 over 4. I think you and I can both agree that if I converted these to decimal forms, this would be 0.75, 0.75, and 0.75. Now, when we're dealing with positive negative fractions, these are all positive fractions. And I just want to let you know that sometimes you might see a negative fraction written like this, like negative 3 over 4. So this is the same thing as negative 0.75. Sometimes you might see the negative sign up right with the numerator. And actually, that also means that you're dealing with negative 0.75. And sometimes you'll also see the negative on the denominator. But even though it's on the denominator, it still means you're dealing with negative 0.75. So before we get into like negative fractions, I just want to let you know that whenever you have a negative fraction, you could see the negative sign out in front, at the top, or at the bottom, but they generally mean the same thing. All right, let's move into a quick little example here. Now, when we're when we're subtracting or adding negative fractions, generally you'll see something like, 1/2, minus 1/4. All right, so when we're subtracting fractions, we still need to follow the same rules as when we're adding fractions. So as you can see that the denominators here, they're different, so we want to make sure that the denominators are the same. So the least common multiple here would be 2. So you want to make sure that your denominators have the same common multiple. In this case, would be 4. And basically, if I go from 2 to 4, that means I need to multiply the numerator by 2, and the denominator will be 4. All right. So when we have an example like this, it's very similar to adding fractions. We keep the denominator the same, and all we do now is we look at the numerators. 2 minus 1 is will simply just be 1. So the answer here is 1 over 4. Now, if I change this question just a little bit, what happens if I put a minus sign in front of the 1/2? All right, so if I put a minus sign in front of the 1/2, then I need to put the minus sign over here. Okay. So now, when both our fractions are negative, basically we would still keep the denominator the same. The denominator will still be 4, but this time the numerator, we need to focus on all of that, and basically we need to solve what is negative 2 minus 1. So if you picture this on a number line, this is 0 and this is negative 2. So this negative 2 is this guy right here, and if we have a minus sign here, that means we're moving towards the left-hand side. All right, so I need to take minus 1 from minus 2, so that would give me a value of negative 3 on the number line. So this would be negative 3 over 4. All right, so that's how you would subtract negative fractions. So just remember, when you're dealing with negative numbers, you need to move to the left-hand side of the number line. All right, let's get into multiplying negative numbers. So if I have something like 1/2 times 3 over 4, so basically when we're multiplying, we just multiply the numerators and the denominators. So in this case, the numerator here is 1 and the numerator over here is 3. So 1 times 3 is simply going to be 3. And on the denominators, I have a 2 and a 4. So 2 times 4 will be 8. So our answer here is 3 over 8. Now, if I put a minus sign here, then that would mean my final answer would be negative. Okay. Now, if I changed, I'm going to move this multiplication sign over here. If I change 3 over 4 to negative 3 over 4, then ask yourself, how many negative signs do you see? Well, I have a negative sign here, and I have a negative sign over there. I have two negative signs. If you have two negative signs, which is an even number, then your final answer will always be positive. Okay, so the rule is if you have an odd number of negative numbers, then you have a negative answer. If you have an even number of negative answers, if you have an even number of negative signs, then your answer will be positive. And this works when we're multiplying or dividing fractions. So let me give you an example here when we divide fractions. Here's 1/2 divided by 3/4 again. And I will put a minus sign here. And for a question like this, whenever you have a division sign, just treat this as a regular question, and don't worry about the negative sign right now, but approach it the same way as when you're multiplying or dividing positive fractions. So this would be 1/2 times, and then I'll flip this over, 4/3. And then once again, all you want to do now is multiply your numerators. 1 times 4, that's going to be 4. And 2 times 3, that's going to be 6. And then you can insert the negative sign in front. So this purple negative sign there is that negative sign right there. Okay. And if I just modify this problem one more time and put like a negative sign here at the beginning of the question, that means this would be negative, and that means your final answer would be positive because this time I have two negative signs. And when you have two negative signs, you have a positive answer. And you can also reduce this to positive 2/3. All right, so that's how we deal with positive and negative fractions. Now, back on Friday, we were going over a question where we were trying to figure out which number is bigger or larger. Let me start off with a simple example here of 3 and 5. I think you and I can both know that 5 is definitely bigger than 3. And the way we write that mathematically is we put the sign pointing towards the 3. So you would read this 5 is greater than 3. Okay. Now the problem is if I actually put a minus sign in front of the 3 and a minus sign in front of the 5, can I still say, would this be true? -5 is... Sorry, I'm trying to say, is -5 greater than -3? Is that true? And that is not true because on a number line, -3 should be bigger than -5. Okay, so remember when you have a number line and when you're dealing with negative numbers, here's -5 and here's -3. If the number that's closer to 0 is actually the bigger number, so in this case 3 is closer to 0 than -5. So in this case, -3 will be bigger than -5. Okay, so the general rule here is, let me just get rid of all this. When you're trying to figure out what number is bigger, it's pretty easy to figure out positive numbers. I mean, here's 2, 6, here's 7, and 3. I think you and I both agree that 2 is less than 6. And I believe 7 is greater than 3. So when we're dealing with positive numbers, I mean, it should be pretty simple to find out which number is bigger than the other number. But if you start inserting negative numbers, then the opposite is true. Sorry, the opposite would be true. So flip the signs. Okay, so in this case, if we put negative signs, then I would say that -2 is greater than -6. And over here, the way we read this is -3 is greater than -7. Okay? So just remember that little trick because it definitely works when we're dealing with fractions as well. So let's go over a fraction question now. Okay, so let's say I have 3/4, and let's say I have 1/2. Well, I know 3/4 is greater than 1/2 because 3/4 is 0.75 and 1/2 is 0.5. So in this case, definitely we can say that 3/4 is greater than 1/2. Now, when we have negative numbers, then we might have something like this, negative 3 over 4 and negative 1/2. The question is, which one is bigger? Well, basically we use the same rule as we did in the previous examples, and all we have to do is we just flip the sign here. So negative 1/2 is bigger than negative 3 over 4. Okay, and you can verify this on a number line. This would be negative 0.5. This is negative 0.75. If this is 0, there's 0, and I'll say this is negative 0.5. This is negative 0.75. And then if you go a little bit further, this might be negative 1. This number, negative 0.5, is much closer to 0 than negative 0.75. So when you're dealing with negative numbers, the number that's closer to the value of 0 is bigger. So negative 1.5, this number here is definitely bigger than negative 3 over 4. Okay. All right, let's just erase this and just go over one final example here. So on the test, we might see something like negative 1 over 6 and I don't know, negative 1 over 5. The question is, which fraction is bigger, negative 1 over 6 or negative 1 over 5? So when I say which one's bigger, what I mean is which one's more positive. Okay, which one has greater value? So you're probably thinking here, and you might be a little bit confused. So when you have a question like this, where I might ask which one is bigger, okay, and if you can't use your calculator, then you need to think about this. Well, one way you could do a problem like this is, let's just change these negative fractions into positive, 1 over 6 and 1 over 5. And then ask yourself, if you're just dealing with these positive numbers, because when you're working with positive numbers, it's a little bit easier to determine which one is bigger. Ask yourself, between these positive fractions, 1 over 6 or 1 over 5, which one is bigger? Well, clearly, this one is 1 over 5 is definitely going to be bigger than 1 over 6, because when you're dealing with positive fractions, you always look at the denominator. And if the numerators are the same, 1 and 1, you want the fraction with the smaller denominator. That will give you the higher value. For example, think about this in terms of a test. If you got 1 out of 5 on a test, meaning that there was 5 questions and you only got 1 question right, is that better or worse than getting 1 question right on the test, but the test is at 6 points? Well, I think 1 over 5 is definitely a better percentage than 1 over 6, because in this case, 1 over 5, you only made 4 mistakes, whereas in 1 over 6, you made 5 mistakes. So clearly 1 over 6 is less than 1 over 5. Now, if I highlight this in green, if you know that is true, then we can say that the opposite would be true. So negative 1 over 6 is greater than negative 1 over 5. Okay, so that's the kind of question that you should expect to see on Tuesday's chapter test. Now, there are a bunch of other negative questions and negative fractions that will come up in this course, but for Tuesday's test, you're not really responsible for certain types of negative fractions. Whatever you see in these videos, this would be good enough for the chapter test. Once we do chapter 3, then the problems will be a little bit more complicated. So I'll definitely have another lesson on that when we get closer to the chapter test. But for Tuesday's test, you don't need to know too much about negative fractions. The last question I want to go over is something like, let's say I have 1/2 here plus, I don't know, 3 over 4 plus 1 over 4. Okay, so if you had a question like this on the test, chances are you would do the equation. You would take care of the brackets first, because BEDMAS tells you that you got to do the brackets first. So this would be 1/2 plus, well, 3 over 4 plus 1 over 4. That's going to be 4 over 4, which is simply going to be 1. So this is the same thing as 1/2 plus 1. And this will be the same thing as 1/2 plus, well, the 1 is 1 divided by 1. So 1/2 plus 2 over 2, which equals to 3 over 2. Okay, so if I give you just simple fractions like that, that's how you would finish the problem. But what happens if I had a minus sign here? All right, let's think about this problem now. What happens if I had a minus sign there? Well, let's just bring down the negative 1/2. And this would be plus, okay, this would be 4 over 4. So now the question is, what's negative 1/2 plus 4 over 4? Well, I will change, well, notice that the denominators, they're not the same, so let's make them the same. This would be 4. I'll change that to a 4. Then this has to be a 2 with a minus sign there, and I'll leave that as a 4. I can get rid of the brackets now and just put a plus here. So this plus here is the exact same plus there. And how would we finish this question off? Well, we see that the denominators are the same. If the denominators are the same, we keep the same denominator, and all we have to do is we just evaluate the numerator. We just need to evaluate this. So what is negative 2 plus 4? Well, on the number line, here's 0, here's negative 2. If you're starting with a negative number and if you're adding a positive number, that means you're going towards the right hand side. So negative 2 plus 4 would actually land you over here at positive 2. So this would be positive 2 and this would be 1/2 simplified. Okay. All right, let's go over another example here. All right, now the question is, what happens if I change this plus sign into a negative sign? Then what do we do? Well, we still use BEDMAS, so this will be negative 1/2 minus, and 3 over 4 plus 1 over 4 is 4 over 4. Okay, so once again, we want to keep our denominators the same. There's a 2 there, there's a 4 there. Let's just change this to a 4. Okay, so that's what we would get, and this minus sign, when that minus sign would stay the same. In this case, once again, you'll notice that the denominators are the same. So it doesn't matter if we're adding or subtracting positive or negative fractions. If the denominator is the same, the denominator at the final result will also be the same. Okay. All right, so now we have negative 2 and negative 4, and how does that work? Well, here's negative 2. And if I'm subtracting a number, that means I'm moving more towards the left-hand side. So what's negative 2 minus 4? Well, that's going to give you a value of negative 6. So this will be negative 6. And that would give you a final value of negative 3 over 2. Okay. Let's go over a few more here. I'll go over one more example here. Okay, so what happens if I make, let's say I make this thing negative now. All right, so now I've got 3 negative signs there. Okay, so we would follow this problem similar to the other problems. I would carry this down, negative 1/2 minus, let's do the brackets first. So we have to evaluate this first, that bracket. Notice that the denominators are the same, so 4 and 4. So what I'll do is I'll put a 4 here, bracket. And now we need to evaluate the numerators. I have a negative 3 plus a positive 1. So what's negative 3 plus 1? Well, if you're not sure, draw a number line. Here's negative 3. Now, since I am adding, this means I'm adding. That means I need to move towards the right. So negative 3 plus 1 would give you negative 2. So then this would be negative 2. So that negative 2 is this negative 2 right there. All right, great. Now, one thing that you'll notice is that there's a minus sign here and a minus sign there. All right, so if you have 2 minus signs, then that will turn this into a positive. So I have positive 2 over 4. Okay, so hopefully you see that when I have 2 negative signs here in green, 2 negatives become a positive. And then for this problem, I would approach it by making the denominators the same. So I'll change this to a plus 2 over 4. Sorry, that will stay the same, 2 over 4, and this would be 4 and negative 2. Okay, so now you see that my denominators are the same, and now we just simply, well, if the denominators are the same, the final answer will have a denominator of 4. And then all you have to do is just evaluate the numerator. I have a -2, I have a plus, and a +2. Well, what's -2 plus 2? -2 plus 2 will give you a value of 0. So this final answer would be 0. Remember, 0 out of 4 is the same thing as the test is out of 4 points and you got 0 points on it. So that would give you a final answer of like 0%. So your final answer here would be 0. All right, Sam, I think that should kind of clarify the kind of questions that could appear on the Chapter 1 test. The Chapter 3 will have a few more difficult positive negative questions, so we'll definitely review that when Chapter 3 comes around. I really recommend that you go over practice test number 1, and if you have time, you should definitely go over practice test number 2. I do have an answer key on YouTube for practice test number 2, and it's on PCR already. So if you go over those two practice tests again, 1 and 2, then I feel pretty confident that you should be able to do well on Tuesday's test. All right, so if you have any more questions, try to come see me Tuesday morning, and then we'll go from there. All right, see ya.